Okay, in the last video we looked at the different basic terminology and ways of naming those different things like the angles and the rays. Here we're going to take a look at the markings in a diagram and what those markings indicate about the diagram, about the figures that are in the diagram. So we're going to take a look here at this diagram, and you can see there are several different items that are marked. And we're going to talk about what each of those markings indicate. So first we'll focus our attention on the marking here in this angle. And we see that it sort of looks like a little box. We also see that same marking in this angle here. That marking indicates that those angles that both have that marking, that those angles measure 90 degrees. So we could say that, and I'm going to call this angle RAX. That angle RAX I'm going to indicate that the measure of angle RAX is 90 degrees. So the way that I do that, I've already written angle RAX. I'm just going to put a lowercase m in front of that, and we read that as the measure of angle RAX. And then I would just say equals, and I would write 90 degrees. Similarly, because I see that same marking here, I can also indicate that the measure of angle DBX equals 90 degrees. Okay. Now, when we have angles that have the same measure, like these two angles, we call those angles congruent. And there is a symbol for congruent. The symbol looks like an equal sign with a little squiggle on the top, and that is the symbol for congruent. So if I want to indicate that I recognize the fact that angle RAX and angle DBX, that they have the same measure, they both measure 90 degrees, I want to indicate that those two angles are congruent. So what I would do when I'm talking about the angle itself rather than the measure, I would just put angle RAX is congruent to angle DBX. Now notice I didn't put the measure of in front of that notation, because here I'm talking about the angles themselves, and I'm saying that the two angles are congruent to one another. But if I'm talking about the specific measure, 90 degrees, then I do want to indicate that the measures are equal. So in that case, I could write the measure of angle RAX is equal to the measure of angle DBX. Either of these are correct. But if I'm talking about congruent, then I'm referring to the angles themselves and not the measures. And if I'm saying equal, then I am talking about the actual measures of those angles, which is why then I would put an M in the front. Okay, let's move on to some other markings. So the next piece of information that we'll focus our attention on would be the marking here at angle BDX. And I see that exact same marking here at angle DXB. When I see the same marking, and when I say the same, what I mean by that is I see the same number of arcs. Each of those angles has just one arc going through the angle. And that indicates that those two angles are congruent. So it would be correct for me to look at this diagram and write that angle BDX and angle DXB are congruent. And there I'm talking about the angles themselves, so I'm not going to put the measure in front of, I'm just going to put that angle BDX is congruent to angle DXB. If I'm referring to the measures themselves, I would put the measure of angle BDX and the measure of angle DXB. And in that case, I would just say equal because the measures are equal, which again indicates that the angles themselves are congruent. So either of these notations are correct. Now, moving on, I also see in this diagram, I see some line segments using our terminology from the previous video. So I'm taking a look and I'm noticing that line segment XB and line segment BD, they have the same markings, just like their angles had the same markings. Here, line segment BD and line segment BX or XB both have one mark. That indicates that those two line segments are congruent. Very similar to the angles being congruent, line segments can also be congruent, meaning that their lengths are equal. So I could also indicate that their lengths are equal by just using XB and BD and not putting the line segment on top of that. And when I write just XB and BD, that is indicating that I'm talking about the length of those line segments, not the line segments themselves, but the length of them. So in this case, if I'm talking about the lengths XB and BD, I would say that those lengths are equal. So it would be appropriate for me to say that the line segments are congruent and that the lengths of those line segments are equal. Now, I'm noticing over here that I see similar markings again, and I can see that there's a relationship between line segment AR and line segment AX, but I'm noticing also that there are two markings here rather than the single marking. So not only do I know that line segment AR is congruent to line segment AX because of how it is marked, I also know that line segment AR is not congruent to line segment BX, let's say. If it was, then I would see the same marking on both line segments. Because I see a 1 marking over here and a 2 marking over here, I know that they are not congruent, that those two line segments are not congruent. So I do know that line segment AR is congruent to line segment AX, which means that the length of AR, if I'm talking about the length, I don't put the line segment above it, the length of AR is equal to the length of AX.